Talk quietly. Goes up, right about up to World War I. And then it begins to flatten out. In the post-World War II period, the total gains in the real cost of transport on sea lanes has been about zero. That is, all the containerization and increase the size of ships and all that stuff has just been fast enough to offset the rise in unit labor costs, pretty much. So there's no transport revolution, at least in moving goods across the sea during the current episode. So it behaves like any other new innovation. You know, it has this kind of S-curve shape. It accelerates, you know, and then peters out at the end. That's the impact it has on costs and prices. Okay, so that's the first. Second, the Industrial Revolution was diffused throughout Europe and to the offshoots, and that cranked up GDP growth in the core as more and more countries got involved in the Industrial Revolution, and thus the derived demand for everything went up, but in particular the derived demand for luxury foodstuffs went up, and those were mainly produced in the poor periphery. So they got a kick to their terms of trade from that source. But more importantly, the growth rate of manufacturing was even faster than the accelerating growth rate in GDP per capita. I mean, you can't get manufacturing increase its share of GDP, which is what happens when you have industrialization, without manufacturing growing faster than the rest, like ag. And so it does. And so the growth rates are even faster for manufacturing. Manufacturing, of course, what it does is simply process raw materials. You can't make potato chips without potatoes, and you can't make clothes without textiles, and so on and so forth. So it cranked up the derived demand for primary product intermediates, just like today, including fuels. So when manufacturing growth slows down, that is when the United States and Britain and Germany and Sweden are done their transformation, becoming industrial nations, and the industrial share stays at 30% or 35% as they begin to ponder moving into the high-tech service sector episode in their lives, then manufacturing growth rates will slow down and become more like the growth rate of the aggregate economy. So also will the derived demand for intermediates slow down as a result. Third, manufacturing, remember the terms of trade, the relative price of primary products is tripling over this period of 70 years. Give enormous incentive for firms in the core, as I call it, as in England and the US and so on, to search for substitutes, synthetics, alternatives. And of course they find them in the late 19th century and begin to introduce these substitutes, and that further it takes some of the steam out of that demand-led terms of trade boom. So that's the third fact on the table. And finally, the fourth fact is that the terms of trade, as the IMF has showed us over and over and over again with contemporary evidence, is much bigger. Volatility is much higher in primary products. And therefore, terms of trade and price volatility is much higher in the poor periphery than it is in the core. And volatility is not good for growth. Here's some evidence of that. There is a comparison of a volatility measure in the average for the periphery for those 40 years, from 1870 up to World War I. And what is it, 3 times larger, more, 3.5 times larger in the, on average in the poor periphery than it is in the UK. Prices are very stable for the UK and very unstable for the average poor periphery, and that's the average you might care about. There's the Philippines and Southeast Asia, which is about normal, about average high volatility. So we observe a lot of volatility in prices, and those are the four big facts on the table that might possibly give us an explanation for the rise of, a partial explanation for the rise of for the fact number one. So, big question is, maybe those correlations are all spurious, or are they not? Are they causal? So I have to, let's spend a little time with a theory, and then we can look at the magnitudes. So here's the theory. It's pretty straightforward. Let's focus first on the impact of a secular improvement, that big terms of trade boom for the relative price of primary products booming, declining for manufacturers, and ask what it should do to the primary product exporter. In the short run, no question, right? It's unambiguous. I get an improvement in my terms of trade. My GDP is going to go up, and my GDP per capita goes up. Some gain more than others, of course, but on average, the country will gain by this windfall of getting an improvement in its terms of trade. In the medium run, it's even bigger, because once I have this favorable price shock and my export sector screams for more resources, labor migrates to the export sector, capital migrates to the export sector, they start using more natural resources, and just increase the size of the impact by this resource allocation effect. What about the long run? Well, now we're not so sure. And this is what has hung up the literature for so long. We're not so sure. But we didn't have any empirical answers. All we knew is the so-called dynamic effects might offset the gains from trade that we saw in the short run and in the medium term. If we believe that industry is a carrier of growth, as every endogenous growth theory now argues, then there's a possible offset from deindustrialization. So theory is ambiguous. Great. That means history has to answer the question, and that increases my value. Okay, what about the Great Britain and the exporter of manufacturers? Well, in the short run, they get an improvement in terms of trade. Again, it's unambiguous. Increases GDP, incomes, some more than others in the economy, but unambiguous increase in incomes. Medium term, even bigger. And the better the country is at getting resources to the favorite sector quicker, the bigger the bang on GDP and GDP per capita. Long run, no ambiguity. If you believe industry is a carrier of growth, and for the industrial country, trade reinforces their industrial comparative advantage and their concentration in industry, it's in the long run, it's unambiguous. It's going to get a kick to growth. What should we find when we look at history? What we should see out there is an asymmetric impact. Secular improvements in the terms of trade is going to reward one set of countries more than others. And the one set of countries that are unambiguously rewarded are those that are exporting manufacturers and specializing in industry. And it's unclear what the story is going to be for the primary product producer. What about the volatility of prices? We were talking about the secular increase in the terms of trade. What about its volatility? Well, first, this time we'll look at the manufacturers first. The exporter of manufacturers, Britain, the US, Germany, they're richer and they can insure against price volatility a lot more cheaply than poor countries can. What I mean by that is They are well integrated into financial capital markets. And financial capital markets, as they do today, when times are not like they have been the past year and a half, that well-integrated financial capital markets can smooth performance. And the IMF studies say that's been the main contribution of modern capital markets over the past 30 years. Smoothing volatility and performance. But only those countries that are well integrated into capital markets will gain that benefit. So they're kind of covered by being well integrated into capital markets. And their governments are more sophisticated. They get revenues from various sources, not just dependent on customs duties and such. So they're less hit by volatility in price and volatility in trade and volatility of revenues being generated by that trade. They have more eggs in their basket. They export many products, which spreads the risk with the volatility attached to certain products and not to others. And in any case, the kinds of goods they export have less volatility to them, services and manufacturers. On the other hand, the primary producers unfortunately suffer. They are not well integrated into capital markets. It's very hard for them, therefore, to exploit the advantages of being integrated into those capital markets to smooth this volatility for them. Their governments rely very heavily on import duties. Latin America, up until the 1870s and 1890s, 70 or 80% of their government revenues from Brazil and Mexico were coming from export and import duties. Nowadays, it's 5, 10%. They export very few products. Brazil did too. A lot of coffee and rubber, and that's it. So they're very vulnerable to price shocks as a result, because they have so few products in their basket. And the kinds of things they export, in any case, inherently have greater volatility, as you have seen for commodity prices over the past few years, exhibit so much volatility. So we know, economists know, and certainly you folks here at AIM know, that risk aversion begats lower accumulation. We don't like uncertain worlds. And uncertain worlds and volatile worlds tends to suppress accumulation. So what should I find in history? Asymmetry. What I just asserted for secular improvement in the terms of trade now is reappearing in terms of the volatility issue.